going to talk to you today about the Ouroboros, the old snake eating its own tail. This is the 10th principle of the substrate. At the Prestige, we have two working models, somatic models. One of them deals with the somatic skins. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And the other one is what we call the substrate, which are 10 foundational principles of somatic development. Each one correlates with a mind-body practice that we could say is a capacity builder. And then we talk about the expression. This is going to be a great topic, and we're going to be delving into the last of 10, the final of 10. It's the hardest one to cultivate, and it is the most important by far. It's the integration factor, and one that allows you or gives you access to unscripted moments. In other words, you get to choose who you are in the moments that follow. Very cool. In the last video that Lindsay put out, she talked about bringing the weather, how you get to actually dictate and determine, well, not only how you show up, but maybe the atmosphere of the field in the room. Fantastic topic. But before one can do such a thing, they must be able to access true neutral and then have the conscious wherewithal to choose subsequent action. So this is a huge topic. This is not for maybe an entry-level watch. This is going to be for people that have a bit of experience in the domain of mind-body performance / somatic centering. But it's going to be fantastic. So we're going to be hitting this topic of the Ouroboros. The repetitive loop that we find ourselves in, what we often call personality or mistake for personality, but which is just on the one hand programming and on the second hand prediction. Okay, that's going to be the first part. Second part is going to be what I call accessing center or finding true neutral. In other words, how do we go from conditioning into a state of true neutrality so that we can begin to create? And then the third phase is going to be what I call the breach, meaning now that we have this space to choose, how do we choose? Okay, or where do we move from there? And it often looks like from the outside a breach of personality. You're not doing what I thought you would do. How's that happening? Stay with me for the conversation. It's unscripted as usual, so this may take a few, meandering turns, but I promise you will gain insight into your own condition patterns and how to breach them in the end, which is a fantastic state of empowerment. So first, the premise of the Ouroboros. I'm going to draw this out, a little bit of a graph. Everybody loves my drawings. They're legendary. Still not legendary. But the Ouroboros, the constant cycle, has two components to it. The first is maybe what we call top-down cognition. How is the brain running the system? But the other part, the less talked about part, is the bottom-up dictation, which means neural programming, patterns that the body has already repeated so many times that when it re-enters shapes and forms, the mind re-enters those prior thoughts and emotions. It's incredibly powerful, and most of us are unconscious to it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the former because you can get a lot of that through Name Your Psychological Approach video. There's a lot of resources for that to look at the ruminations. How are you actually processing things that are coming in? Are you perceiving threat when there is no threat? What stories are you telling yourself? That's all top-down dictation. There is one caveat, which is this moment consciously dictated or unconscious programming? To be aware of that as a starting point is critical, because if you're not, you're running on what we call the default mode network, which is we're built to automate most of what we do so that we don't have to spend energy on it. It buys us time, it buys us energy and resources to be able to do new things and find nuance in our experience. But most of us get up, get the coffee, eat the same breakfast, drive the same path to work, do the same work, come home, meet the same people, so on and so forth. None of it is like traveling for the first time, where everything is, okay, should I take that road? Should I try this cuisine? I don't know any of this stuff. Everything is novel and new and experience, and it opens up your attentional field to perceive more and experience more. If you haven't traveled, go travel. It's incredible, right? For the first time especially. Now you do that 100 times and all of a sudden you stop caring and noticing. Same way that we do with a regular day. It's not needed to get through the day. This is on the one hand great. It makes us efficient. On the other hand, it's horrible because it makes us unconscious NPCs. non-character players, robots. You're not choosing anything, you're just executing. This is largely what mindful awareness practice will help you access, the space between stimulus, the things that are happening, and your response to them. There's that little bit of a gap. When we go a layer deeper, though, this is what standing meditation as a practice will give us access to, and the integration of the perceptual field, but also what the body is doing underneath it. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Very cool stuff. So, the pattern self. The other side of this is, what is the body doing? What is it repeating that is signaling to the mind that we're in the same place doing the same thing? On the one hand, we could call this the mind-body's predictive ability, but where does that prediction come from? It comes from thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a thing, practiced, repeated over and over, and it gives me a little bit of an edge into the next few moments, unless it's an outdated program, which is a big problem, right? How many times have you repeated the same story in your head for something that's been bothering you? How many times have you listened to a loved ones or friends or something like this, who you can perceive from the outside is just dead? They're just stuck in the mud, right? They're not going anywhere. They're saying the same shit, doing the same shit, and they think that this rumination is somehow growth or process development, and it's clearly not from the outside. The key is for us as individuals to be able to perceive that for ourselves and to make different choices so that tomorrow the story breaks. Talked about how that happens from the mind, how this happens from the body. Now, there are not a lot of great studies on this, but as somebody with 30 plus years in the mind-body domain, having studied this through and through, and have gone back to some of the older traditions through martial arts, through yoga, these are known performance attributes. They're hard to study. And so we have some foundation in terms of neurological study, trauma studies, in the ways that the body stores. They call it stored memory, but it's just stored repetition and neural signaling. The same thing happens over and over again, and then the body starts to take forms. The person that was I don't want to go into abuse, but the person that maybe had a difficult childhood and maybe, didn't have a lot of confidence and was insulted a lot and not really didn't have a lot, and didn't have a supportive social group, well, this starts to happen, right? They start to cave in physically, or what we call melting, from those experiences, because they're experiencing the stress and they're experiencing the fear, and that pattern gets stored in that physiological response to those situations. But then what happens 10 years later, they're not in a situation where they're afraid or they're being, offended or insulted or anything like that, but the body still lives in this form, and so it signals to the mind, well, you're not doing okay. You're not in a good place. Just shrink yourself. Don't be seen. And so this continues to happen. The feedback loop, or the alternative happens in the case of the warrior skin, which is that this happens. I'm resisting that feedback. I'm resisting that environmental force, and I'm bracing. I'm tightening, and I'm resisting the external environment. The same thing happens 10 years later. Maybe that served you as a child. Maybe that served you in a specific season of life, but now it's not serving. I'm out having a coffee with a good friend. Why am I still so fucking tense? Okay? That is a story that lives in the body. A lot of people are unconscious to this, but once you start to see and train, especially what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the different aspects that underlie, like the primary skill of each somatic skin, once you start to identify that and train it for yourself, but see it in others, you see these lived stories everywhere. Everybody plays them out. Where are the eyes placed? Are they hyper-focused and vigilant, or is it diffuse? Are they activated? Or are they deactivated and passive? Like, even the eyes tell that story. The breath does the same thing in the chest or in the abdomen. And you start to see these signals and you say, okay, they're living out old patterns, or they are consciously present and with me in this moment. That's incredible. So, the pattern self, what you need to take away. Top down can be consciously dictated, but it does require training. Mindful awareness, one of the chief, practices to activate this. But it can be bottom up, repeated patterns of structural stacking or melting bracing versus melting, location of the eyes, depth of the breath, all the stuff we've talked about in other videos. These patterns relived unconsciously reinforce and bring up the same thought patterns and hormone profiles of the person living the thing for the first few times. You think that's a personality. It's stored memory, repeated pattern. Let's get to the second part. Okay, so if you're following me so far, we understand that the mind can dictate patterns. The body can also dictate and reinforce patterns. The next question is, how do we stop these patterns so that tomorrow or the next moment or in this new conversation or in this new dashing and daring phase of my life that I'm not repeating the same shit and I'm moving into new territory, becoming a beast of performance and living the life that I want, right? This is the question. In order to pass through into new choice, we have to find a way to unwind these patterns and create space enough so that I see, okay, same stimulus, new response. I need to create space enough to choose. This is critical. There are many practices that do this from top down, but from bottom up, there are not a lot of great practices. So we get to the Ouroboros practice, standing meditation. What practice allows us to integrate mind and body and create space from those conditioned thoughts and actions and choose something new? Got to get to center first. So I'll draw this out. Hopefully you are by now aware that we've got a person torn between several skins and modalities. We've talked about the warrior. We've talked about the shapeshifter. Ignore my spelling. We talked about the sage, and we've talked about the asset, which is not a character coming from your nether regions. It is a nervous system orientation. How cool. Each one of these dictates a certain nervous system orientation. Most of us have a dominant. Some of us have cultivated maybe a double dominance, and some of us maybe have gotten to a point where they're in balance, but these can be at low grade or high grade. Somebody that doesn't train, practice, or attune their somatic orientation can wind up in any of these realms by default, just because their external environments have imposed certain types of pressures and constraints. And before you had the language for it, your body organized a response, either to resist as the warrior, to reason or focus as the sage. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, so don't confuse them. To adapt and release as the shapeshifter, or to sense and feel as the asset. We've covered that in other videos. If you don't know your dominant one, quiz, link in the description. Take it, learn it. Why not? Pause the video. You should know this about yourself. We also give you the insights and training prescriptions to be able to cultivate your skin and then eventually command all four of them, which is where this goes in the end. Super cool. So what you need to know about this in this section of centering is that each one of these skins is responsible for one attribute of center. Okay, so if you have three that are cultivated, but one of them is lacking, it's very difficult to recenter yourself and to breach old patterns. Each one is highly relevant. Let's look at how those look in the process of standing meditation. This doesn't mean you have to become a master of standing meditation. What it does mean is you need to understand the mechanisms that make standing meditation effective, from old Qigong practices in the park in China to how you can get yourself to a maybe 2 or 3 second immediate reset and recenter so that I can choose in the moment. That's powerful. Not about the 20-minute sessions every day, although those might be necessary to get you into that level of command. It's really about the instantaneous optionality and freedom to choose. So each one of these is responsible for something critical. The warrior is responsible for what I've called the rising force in the body. Structure, often accompanied by tension, though this is dependent on one's level of skill. Okay? The shapeshifter is responsible for the softening of your frame. Could also call it release. Could also call it non-attachment. attachment, which is not just a psychological phenomenon, it is an embodiment. It happens through and through. To truly access it in the mind, it must exist in the body. Release. Okay, so these two forces together create what we call structural symmetry. Or better known as balance. Don't make the mistake of thinking that symmetry and balance is a psychological phenomenon. Practice this for any length of time and you will quickly see that the body dictates more of how you are in the moment than what you think the mind is. Most of this is spinning, but as soon as the body accesses true balance and center, all of a sudden we're able to move beyond all those patterns. Once these are activated, and so this is, by the way, this is the literal process and activation of this form, so that when you're doing it, whether in standing meditation or in a 3-second reset, this is the literal process. The first one, shoulders back, crown point lifts. Use enough tension to structurally set yourself, elongate the spine, set your bones, stack your bones, and then release all unnecessary tension. That's the warrior followed by the shapeshifter in real time. That took 2 seconds, okay? Now we're going to get into the other two. The next one that we activate is going to be the sage. The sage controls focus. We could also call it concentration. But the easiest way to think of the sage or focus in this moment, if here are the eyes and I'm looking here, fix attention on something. Something on the horizon, your partner's eyes if you need to, but something in your immediate purview, fix the eyes on it. And then finally for the asset, the master of sensing and sensation, there's going to be an extension of the softening that we bring up here, because this is what gives us access to sensation on the one hand, but also broad awareness. So, focus up top, awareness through the body, sensation. The combination of these two are extraordinary. You can practice them right now while you're watching or listening to this video. Fix the eyes on something. I'll use a light switch in the distance, and then soften so that I can start to take in my peripheral vision. The initial focal point acts as an anchor for my attention. If you aren't practiced in this, practice this. This is critical. You have to focus on something long enough to still the mind. And if you do this for the next 5 seconds, maybe pause the video, put your eyes on something with intention. Don't just look, intentionally set. That alone is an act of unconditioned action. You are leading with intention. So whatever the old identity or self would have done, that person's no longer here. I am dictating where my eyes are, and therefore my attention. And you'll notice very quickly, the mind gets still. Okay, so we have specific practices that underlie each one of these attributes and orientations. The one we use for this is reverse counting, to constantly fix and refocus attention over and over. But once that's done, the mind starts to still, the noise goes away. Now when we soften, it's having attention relatively anchored, but I'm now expanding sensation through the body, awareness through my perceptual field and peripheral vision. Now I'm seeing and fixed, but I'm open, sensing and receiving. I'm not just patterning, repeating the same shit over and over. I'm now in a relationship and a conversation with my environment in a way that's authentic and unscripted. This is the process. Warrior, shapeshifter, sage, asset. And then in the next few moments, I have an opportunity to see, to feel in a way that isn't automated. It's a conversation. And now I can choose what might be the best response. Maybe it is tensing and resisting if I'm actually being physically confronted. If it's not a threat, but I'm having a stress response, Maybe it's softening, sensing, and listening in a different way. These are the options and choices that we can create from true center. Extraordinary. And finally, the breach. Now, I've already hit this through the other 2 points, but I want to land it and make sure it hits home. We can associate those patterns as points of identity. We can say that maybe our personality has 2 elements to it. One is how we choose to show up when we're consciously aware, and the other one is, well, how do we just act all the time? That one is often dictated by this full spectrum of looping thoughts and repeated bodily orientations, nervous system orientations. The breach comes when we find this space and center, we activate the reset, and then in the next moment, we choose. This can come in many forms. This can come through maybe a psychological shift or releasing. But what I'm trying to get you to see is that the relationship between these two is incredibly powerful. It's powerful when it's unconscious because it dictates all of our choices and actions without us getting it or seeing it. But once we become conscious of it, now what happens? I can choose to be the warrior when that isn't my default. I can choose to be focused when I feel overwhelmed as an empath. I can choose to release if I'm entering with too much tension or bracing. I can release that from the system and become open and accepting. That is powerful. And it doesn't mean that I'm like choosing to be a different human necessarily, but from the outside, it starts to look like a personality shift. Aren't you normally like this? Aren't you normally reactive? Aren't you normally a bit too passive and kind of laissez-faire? Where's this coming from? And it's like, well, yeah, we can be anybody. Our nervous systems are imbued with tremendous range. On the one hand, we need to cultivate that from the capacity side. We talk about in the Somatic skins, we talk about that in the Grand Formidable, both books linked in the description. And we coach it at the Prestige. Come join us. It's amazing. So we need to train the capacity factors that underlie each one of these skins. But once we find neutral, I am no longer at the beck and call of the unconscious orientations of my past. That's incredible. So if I've always shown up as the asset or the shapeshifter, but this moment needs a different version of me, maybe I'm working on a project, maybe I want to write or finish a book, but I keep getting a chapter in and then I'm saying, well, you know, if it happens, it happens. A shapeshifter dominates. Maybe that's my profile. What would that look like if I have a little bit more warrior, present warrior, conscious warrior activated? And that's not a mindset, it is an orientation. Instead of this, I'm here for the next 5 minutes. Does that get me through this writer's block? Does it get me back into a point of engagement when the process becomes hard? Each one of these skins is a superpower and an orientation that can give me access to versions of myself that I don't often experience. Incredible stuff. So that's what I got. I mean, coming full circle, getting back to the premise of the Ouroboros, this works on two sides of the same coin. The first aspect is the unconscious repetition, the default mode network repeating itself, and then the conditioned bodily patterns that reinforce thoughts, that reinforce emotions through circumstances that are long dead, right? Snake eating its own tail, a victim of its own patterns. The second part of it is, if we can find center and breach that pattern, all of a sudden the Ouroboros becomes a state of empowerment. I can use this awareness, this conscious awareness, and this somatic reset to be able to access versions of myself that don't exist and destroy the loop. Yeah, super cool stuff. So again, we coach this stuff at the Prestige with so much more, our Performance Somatics community. Part of that is looking at the hardware that dictates how we show up from one moment to the next. And the other part of it is Lindsay and I have a whole host of powerful tools from decades and decades of coaching. So we mesh all these together in powerful coaching circles and extraordinary and unique events. Man, they're cool. Next one, Somatic, Rise of the Asset. Brilliant, in about a month. But yeah, reach out, see if it's the right thing for you. And if you take the quiz and know your skin, haven't done it yet, what are you waiting for? It'll put you on the newsletter and it'll give you a little bit of an orientation over a few days just about how we help people achieve their next great horizon, which is what we're all about. It's not about this stuff for its own sake. It's how you can use these tools to breach personal plateaus and do in 3 months what would often take you 3 years or more. That's what we're about. So take the quiz, see if we can help you. If you don't like it, unsubscribe. Costs you nothing, but at least know your orientation in your skin. See you in the next video.